Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tonellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I have made it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by Hachette Australia. Listeners, the depth of talent we have within the Australian literary community never ceases to amaze me. Week after week, books from authors who are new to me land on my desk, authors with incredible stories to tell. And today I get the chance to chat with a multi-published author whose new book was released late March 2025. Flynn is the author of several novels that include the astonishing novel Mammoth, told from the point of view of a 13,000-year-old fossilised mammoth, a book which was shortlisted for a number of awards in 2021 and which drew praise from some of the brightest literary minds. But today, listeners, we're talking about Orpheus Nine, published by Hachette Australia. This is a deeply thought-provoking, compelling book set in a tiny rural Australian town against the backdrop of a mysterious global event killing 9-year-old children. A supernatural thriller that will have you turning pages deep into the night and hugging your children close when you're done. And I'm simply delighted to welcome Chris to the podcast today. Hi, Chris.
Hello, Claudine.
Now, this is a book unlike anything that I've read before. It's kind of a thriller with a dystopian edge where we witness the breakdown of society through the experiences of people living in this tiny town. So I wanted to ask you, where did the idea for the novel first come to you from?
So this is an unusual answer, but when my last book came out, it was a book of short stories that were called Here Be Leviathans, and it was set from the point of view of a lot of animals and non-living things, like a hotel room, an airline seat. And it was an unusual little book, but because Mammoth had come out during COVID and I didn't get to do any events or go to any bookstores or sort of see anyone, but it sold really well. So I knew there was a lot of people out there that had engaged with my work. So when the short stories came out, I decided to do a bit of a book tour, and I drove myself 7,000 kilometers around Australia, just staying in murder motels, just like cheap little motels along the way, but visiting, small towns, big cities, over 100 bookshops I went to. And sometimes you were just there for 20 minutes. You go in, have a little chat, sign some books, and then back in the car onto the next one. So it was a kind of a relentless tour. You always think of these things as being uber glamorous, but it really wasn't. But when I got back, I thought, well, that's it for me. I'm going to take the summer off. I don't want to have to think about books anymore. And of course, the creative mind being what it is, as soon as I got home, I think 2 nights after I got home, I had a dream, and it was the opening scene of this book, which is the family standing on the sidelines at a sort of under 10s footy game in a small regional town. And I live in a small regional town. And the kids all stop what they're doing, freeze. They start to sing a strange verse in Latin, and then they swell up full of salt and die. And I was standing there on the sidelines in the dream right next to the parents. And I'd never thought about this before. I don't really know at the time, I didn't really know where it came from. But when I got up, I wrote down the dream. And instantly, as soon as I did that, the rest of the story just came to me. And I sort of made about 2 pages of notes. And that was it. The whole thing, right from the beginning to the end, was there. The characters, I knew who they were, I knew their names. So that was a mystery to me and kind of annoying because I wanted to take a break. And all of a sudden, I felt this terrible responsibility. Like, I've got to write this story. I've got to do it now before it leaves me. And so I spent the summer writing the first draft of it. And it was quite sort of a feral first draft, really, because it was in the voice of the characters and they were all quite angry, the different groups of parents. And it wasn't until later, sometimes you don't really know where something comes from. And it wasn't until more recently when the book has come out that I started to realize probably what the origin of it was, because people think there's something wrong with me, all these 9-year-olds dropping dead. But I grew up in a foster family, in that I wasn't a foster kid myself, but my parents were foster parents. And so my sister and I were the sort of natural born kids in the family. And we had over 100 kids come through our house when I was a teenager. They were all my little brothers and sisters, really. And sometimes they'd be with us for a few weeks, other times a few months, a couple of times a few years. But then they'd move on. They'd either be adopted or they'd go back to their natural parents. And we would never see them again. Never, or we weren't, in fact, allowed to have any contact with them ever again. And that is almost as if they were dead, they were gone. And I never really sort of processed it, but because my sister and I were like we were the older brother and sister, but we were also like the parents to these kids. And to have so many little kids in your life and for them to be taken away is a very unusual situation. And I think now, looking back, that maybe this book has its origin in that a little bit too, that there's something that I had never really processed or dealt with, that sort of strange loss. And this was my way of processing that, to write an odd book about some families in a small town who lose their kids and never see them again. And it happens, in fact, to everyone. So it's a bit of an unusual answer to the question, but a long-winded one, sorry. But I think that's where it came from.
Utterly fascinating. So I guess the next question is, well, when you said that idea and that dream came to you, so did the end product kind of live up to what you imagined it would be?
That is a very good question. It's always the tricky thing when you're a writer, the idea is sometimes this golden, sparkling thing, but then your ability falls short of being able to convey that idea. And I guess that's where the sort of drama and frustration is in being a writer. Because the initial draft just sort of spewed out of me and I was just observing it, thinking, look at this thing appearing, and it was in the voice of the characters. I didn't know if it was any good, if it actually did the story justice at all. And my publisher at the time, they hated it. They really despised it.
Oh, no.
So yeah, so my agent said, okay, then we're probably going to have to look for a new publisher. And I thought, oh, well, if they don't like it, everyone else is going to think just the same. It must be terrible. I must have just really messed this up. But when we put it out to market, every other publisher wanted it. And so we actually had a bit of a bidding war over it. And I was a little bit surprised by this because you just don't know whether it lands or not. As it turns out that when we came to do the big structural edit, there was like a 25-page report on the manuscript, and I thought, oh, actually, it is a mess. And I was actually a bit embarrassed when I read over the manuscript. I thought, oh, how did anyone like this? It's so unlikable. The characters were so deeply detestable, all of them, because it was in their heads, and they were very angry. So I rewrote it completely in the third person, and but because I knew the characters so well, I knew how they thought. It wasn't that difficult to do that rewrite, and so it all came together pretty quickly. I guess the issue with a story like this is, can you ever really do it justice? No matter what you do, someone's going to be dissatisfied, and we're already seeing that a little. It's got great reviews from the media. But on Goodreads, which not that any author should ever look at Goodreads, it's pretty funny. I find it kind of amusing to look at it. Some people love it and some people really hate it. So, but I sort of don't mind that. I would rather one of my books engendered such a strong visceral reaction where readers think, oh, this is great or this is terrible, rather than people go, it's okay. So it exists in the world now. It is what it is. I could have probably gone in 1,000 different directions with this, but I think keeping it to like a small Australian town, a very sort of claustrophobic region, was probably the right way to go.
There is a town of Gatton in rural Queensland, in the Lockyer Valley, to be precise. But I don't think this is the town that you envisaged for the purposes of this novel.
No, and in fact, the name Gatton, I had no idea where that name had come from. It's spelled slightly differently in the book. I looked up the Gattan, which is the town in the book. I looked that up, thought, oh, there is no Gatton. Great. And I went ahead, and then after the book was done and it was waiting to come out, I was speaking to a friend of mine down here where I live, and she's from Queensland. And I was telling her about the book. I said, oh, it's set in a small town that I made up called Gatton. And she said, I'm from Gatton. I said, what do you mean? And it turns out that she is from Gatton in Queensland, Gatton. And she maybe must have said it to me at some point over the years. And I haven't really, you know, noticed, but it's sort of sunk into my head. So that's, I think, where the Gatton thing maybe came from. So you have to be careful with that sort of stuff. But the state is never mentioned in the book, and when the city is mentioned, the city that's close by, it's not named either. And I did that on purpose so that the book so if you're reading it in South Australia, Western Australia, Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, it could be in any of those states. And so it has that sort of universal Australian appeal.
I only mentioned Gatton because I happened to be in rural Queensland not so long ago and passed it. So I thought, oh, I wondered if it was the same one. But Chris, look, I wondered for those who've yet to read the book, if you could tell us a little bit more about the story.
Right. So after the opening scene, which is the families on the sideline, watching the 9-year-olds die, that sounds, like a grim opening to a book. And I suppose it is a bit of a shock opening. But after that, the book goes more into, it looks more at how these groups of parents struggle to cope in the aftermath of the disaster, because it keeps happening every day. When kids turn 9, the same thing happens to them. And so we have essentially three groups of parents. One of them, Jess, she has lost her 9-year-old son. He was on the footy field. She feels really abandoned and not supported, and ends up becoming quite radicalized by looking at websites that justify her sense of indignance that something has happened. No one's doing anything about it. No one seems to care. Then we have Haley, who has an 8-year-old. And so her 8-year-old, as all are on the clock. As soon as they turn 9, the same thing's going to happen. And she also becomes, I suppose, radicalized in her own way, in that she decides to remove salt from her child's diet so that to try and prevent the event from happening. And in doing so, makes her kid's life an absolute misery, considering it could be the final few months of her life. It's not going to be very happy for her. And then there's Dirk, and Dirk has his son is the only kid who's left standing on the footy field because he just turned 10 a few weeks prior. And so initially he thinks, well, that was lucky. But then he starts to think, wait a minute, if all the kids, turning 8 and 7 and below are all going to, the same thing's going to happen to them, then my son will be the last generation of children left alive. And so he thinks, well, this is going to be good for us. We could maybe profit from this. My son's going to be one of the leaders in the new world to come. So it's kind of about how these three people in this small town who grew up together and who'd known each other all their lives, instead of banding together whenever this disaster happens, they really fragment and break apart, and they all go in separate directions and all end up at loggerheads with each other. And so the book just analyzes how that happens in communities in response to disaster, where we resort to thinking about, well, how's it going to affect me, rather than thinking on a more general way about how is this affecting everyone? How can I help? We look to our own interests first. So it analyzes that kind of impulse in us, which is not necessarily a very pleasant one.
Indeed. And I wanted to say that I think you've really nailed the hopelessness and the despair felt not only by the parents who have lost their children, like Jess, and in the book you call these orphans, but also of the parents whose children are yet to turn 9. So people like Haley and Jude, as well as the children themselves, the young children who are facing this prospect of turning 9 and then dying. And there are conspiracy theories flying around, relationships breaking down over the best way to handle the looming disaster, and despair that no one yet has been able to fix the problem, as you mentioned in relation to Jess. And to some extent, Chris, I felt like this was a nod to the kinds of things that happened during COVID. And I wondered if you would like to talk about that a little.
Yeah, look, it wasn't something that I was very conscious at first, but I suppose it must have been subconsciously another thing that was working in the back of my mind. Living in regional Victoria as I do, we weren't locked down as much as they were in the city, but we were still occasionally locked down. And it was a very strange time for all of us, right? It's a time in our lives that we'll never forget, and we all hope will never happens again. I dread to think what would happen if something worse came along and we were told that we couldn't leave our homes again. I'm not sure people would respond as amenably this time. Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that the book sort of touches on, is what happens to us whenever the rug is pulled out from underneath us and we don't have any sense of agency or the ability to lead the lives that we want to lead, where something is beyond our control. And we talked about this a little bit before the show, th this idea of control. It's actually much more important to us than we perhaps realize, in that, you know, COVID showed us that the world is essentially chaotic and unpredictable. None of us saw that coming. None of us knew that was just around the corner. But then we never really know what's around the corner at all. But we sort of assume that we do. We try to introduce certainty to our lives. We think, well, if we do this and then do this, then this will happen. But it's a bit of an illusion, and that illusion was starkly shown to us during COVID. So this book takes that a little bit further and says, well, if something else comes along that is more challenging, would we learn the lessons from COVID? Because I think enough time has passed now where we can all admit that mistakes were made, and we all made them. We believed things that weren't necessarily true. We chose not to listen to other things. We turned on our neighbors. We turned on our family and friends. We didn't necessarily behave in the best, manner possible. But would we learn from that? Are we capable of that self-reflection and thinking, okay, so next time this happens, I'll be a bit more sensible about this and I'll approach this differently. I'm not sure we would. I suspect it might be even worse.
I was just thinking the same very thing. I'm not sure that we have learned our lessons. But in any event, I think it might be a little gruesome to talk in depth about the way the children died. But I was fascinated by how you came to imagine this specific scenario. The children in that, at least that first event, they're all struck down at the age of 9. And we were talking about, them being on the footy field in Gatton. But 130 million children around the world died that first day in the context of your novel. Their systems are flooded with sodium, and effectively they kind of die of kidney and heart failure.
Yep.
But before they do that, they chant this Latin verse from King Lear. And I'm not even going to attempt to quote the phrase in Latin, but its translation is, as flies to wanton boys are we to the gods, they kill us for their sport. So I wanted to ask you, Chris, if you could tell me a little bit more about this and its importance to the events of this novel.
Yeah, the interesting thing was that in my dream, the kids were singing in Latin, and I studied Latin in high school, and it was quite hard for me to discern what it was they were saying. That all sort of came about through a very sort of odd process. But the idea there is that what happens is inexplicable. It is something that will be a mystery, a background mystery throughout your reading of the book, where even though you are plunged into the minutiae of the daily lives of the people who are trying to navigate their way through this disaster that struck the world, occasionally you're reminded, oh yes, that's right. The kids sing this weird Latin thing. What's that about? And in the book, there's a couple of different theories as to what it's about, but it's not really giving anything away to say it's never really explained. And that was done on purpose because I sort of know what it is, but I thought that if I went straight ahead and resolved that and explained it, it could only be unsatisfying. And I love those kind of Stephen King style books where there is a very real, recognizable world. Often, in fact, in his books, they are quite small towns. He very rarely sets books in major cities. But I love that idea of a recognizable world that we all participate in, but there's just something strange about it that we can't quite put our finger on. And it gives you that sense of unease. And I think that was important to have that in the book, whereby it wasn't a standard, there's been an issue, scientists are going to work and solve this problem, and boom, now everything's better. Instead, I kind of double down as the book goes on. And, we don't want to give away the shock ending. I'm quite happy for people to know that there is a bit of a surprise at the end that may not be what they expect. And I kind of love that, because I find it a bit unsatisfying whenever books or movies, there is a sort of pat resolution and it's all explained. So I'm kind of keeping mum a little bit about the Latin thing. There's a hint, I suppose, in there for people if they want to try and dig a little deeper and try to work it out. I do have a completely left field, off the wall idea for a sequel to this, should it do well, but that'll just drive people mad when they hear what that is. So, so maybe it'll never happen. It might be for the best.
But I guess for me, Chris, I was thinking about the King Lear quote. For me, it highlighted, and you could say I was completely wrong, but it highlighted this seemingly random nature of things like pandemics or natural disasters, why some people succumb and others are spared. Do we live or die at the whim of a higher power? And can
Right.
humans ever have control of our environment? So this is kind of the things that I was thinking about when I read that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely what I was sort of getting at there is we do feel very powerless, particularly in contemporary society. We are presented with a seemingly endless series of disasters. We're hit in the face with them, week after week, some terrible thing that's happened. And, we're expected to sort of respond or somehow parse what's happened or, come to an understanding. But it's very, very difficult for us to do that. We are never really armed with all the facts. We try our best to inform ourselves, but we don't really know what's going on in the bigger, wider world. But we have the illusion of certitude. And I think that's kind of interesting that being right about something or knowing the answer has become so important to us today. So important in that, how many people do we all know who believe they're absolutely correct in everything they say, even though that can't be the case, right? We all have our belief systems and we all think that we are right. In fact, there seems to be quite unfashionable to ever admit that you're wrong about anything or that you may have been mistaken, which is a change in our society, I think. Something has happened in the last sort of 10, 15 years where certitude has become the norm. And if someone doesn't agree with you, then they must be, a monster. And it's a very odd, evolution of human behavior. And it's probably due to social media and access to the internet in a little box that you carry around in your hand all day and politicization of everything in life that has happened now. But yeah, we have so much sensory input coming into our heads these days, more so than any generation has ever had in history. How are we supposed to make sense of it? How are we supposed to know if what we're doing is the right thing or the wrong thing? And that is the case for the characters in this book. They all kind of make their choice and they decide, well, this is what I'm doing. I'm going to remove salt from my child's diet because I absolutely want to believe that that is the correct thing to do, even though it might be the absolutely wrong thing to do. But it's understandable, I think. You can look at each of these characters and feel empathy for them, but you can also feel frustration with them. And that was something I specifically wanted to create, that sort of sense of disquiet when you're reading and you think, oh, I kind of liked her, but now she's doing this. I'm not so sure anymore. That changing of loyalties, I think that's a much more human way to approach characters because it's how we are, right? We do change our minds. We may not like to think about it, but we are sort of sometimes forced to change our minds and admit that the previous version of us was naive or incorrect, but it seems to be increasingly hard for us to manage those sort of transitions in our life.
You talked a little earlier, specifically in relation to Jess and in relation to Haley, about a kind of radicalization that occurs in them. In this book, there's this breakaway group called Kingdom of Hades, and then another called Saltless, which are representative of the different ways the parent groups are dealing with Orpheus Nine. And then we've got Pepper, which is an online app, a kind of rebel group of kids who kind of
Mhm.
band together against their parents
Mhm.
and the extreme reactions of their parents and removing salt from their diet. They're each extremes in their own way, and it got me thinking about radicalization and how this happens, and it happens quite quickly in the novel. There's so much already lost and so much at stake. Even the very survival of humanity is at stake, and yet people are feeling unheard and unseen. And I guess I wanted to ask, was that specifically something you wanted to explore in the novel?
I think it was, this idea of wanting to point the finger and say someone is to blame for what's happening to you. I think we all felt that a little bit, during COVID. We were presented with political figures, medical figures who would, tell us things and we didn't really know if it was true or not. And everyone wants to know whose fault is this? The funny thing is, whenever you think about this sort of stuff, is that do we actually really know how COVID started? I mean, there's after all this time, do we really know? There's 1,000 different stories that you can read on the internet as to where it came from, but do us, the ordinary person, actually know? We're still in the dark, really. And it's this major thing that happened to the world. How can we not have a solution or an answer to that yet? And I find that almost amusing, really, that we are very quick to believe things, even though we clearly just don't have a clue. So, yeah, that was definitely something that played in my mind, this idea of in the absence of nice, simple answers and solutions, this is happening because of this reason, and this is what we're doing to sort it out. We don't really live in a world like that anymore. And so it's sort of understandable that people will seek alternative answers, even though you might be horrified by what they choose to do. And certainly Jess's group that she joins, Kingdom of Hades, which is women who feel like they're not being heard because the magnitude of their loss is immense, but no one really wants to listen. And so they look for scapegoats. Who must be behind this? There must be someone who's orchestrating this, because the idea of it being a random thing is just too terrifying to countenance. And so they're looking for someone to point the finger at. And I think that's a very human response that just shows our frailty in the face of the unthinkable.
It kind of got this Lord of the Flies type of tone in this book where, we've got this kind of breakdown of governmental and social order, and a new world order needs to be established in order to ensure human survival. And Dirk, as you pointed out, is one of the characters. He says, Orpheus Nine is just the latest in a long string of disasters. We're at the start of something new. We just don't know exactly what that will look like yet. And I guess I see his point in some ways. Each thing that happens at a global or even a local level changes humanity. Each war, each natural disaster, or indeed the pandemic, we're not the same. And each time it can feel as if the world is ending. But is it really ending, or are we just starting something new?
Right, that's right, and we're not really equipped to be disaster negotiators. Humans aren't really meant to have disaster after disaster after disaster in their lives. There's a little bit of an addiction to the sort of the big trauma stuff in the world at the moment, and certainly the media feeds into that, I would say. But is it really as bad as it's being made out? Should we look at everything as an end, or should we be looking at renewal? And the world can't remain the same. How many times did we hear people saying after COVID, "Oh, we're going to go back to the way it was"? When has anything ever gone back to the way it was? Nothing ever goes back to the old way. There's always, every day is a new day, and brings new challenges, and they may seem similar to old challenges, but you know, you or I are not the same people we were last year. We have changed, and that is just what it is to be human. But I think the pace of change is so fast now that everyone's sort of struggling to keep up and to work out how they're supposed to be. And I think that's reflected a little bit through the character of Dirk, where he thinks, okay, so this is a terrible thing that's happened, but it's a good thing for me. And to give you a little anecdote, I actually thought his character might be a little bit on the nose, that people might say, oh, no one would really, dismiss the suffering of others so quickly and think about how he can profit from it. But it's sort of shocking. A few days after the book came out, I was at Supernova, which is a sort of Comic Con type thing. And you're sitting at a table all day long from 10 till 6 signing books. And it's all mostly young people who are in cosplay. They're dressed as their favorite characters from movies and comics. And then at one point, this sort of middle-aged couple came along who looked really out of place. And they had two kids with them girls who looked to be about 9 years old. And I thought, uh-oh, this is going to go badly wrong here. And they came up to talk to me, and they were very interested in my books. And I was telling them about the other books, Mammoth and so on. And then the mum said, "Oh, what's this one, Orpheus Nine?" I said, "Oh, I don't know if that's going to be for you. It's sort of about a worldwide supernatural event where all the 9-year-olds die." And she's like, "Oh, really? Oh, that sounds terrible. Oh no, I wouldn't read that. Oh, wait a minute. How old did you say they were?" And I said, 9. And she said, "Oh, my girls are 11 and 10, so we'd be fine. I'll get it." And it stunned me that that was her response. I thought, whoa, so how quickly she moved on from saying, "Oh, that sounds terrible. What an awful thing to happen," to, "Oh, wait a minute, we'd be okay. So I guess I'll engage with that." So I do wonder if maybe more people would be like Dirk than we might like to think, would just say, well, we're going to be fine. So this can work to our advantage. But, to him, it is something new, right? He is arguably adapting the best out of all the characters, in that he is realistic in thinking, well, this is happening. I can't stop it. I can't do anything about it. But can I at least prepare my son for the new world to come? And, people hate Dirk. Let's, say it what it is. I've had someone texted me this morning and said, I can't get Dirk out of my head. I hate him so much. Um, but he's in there for a reason, to show that a lot of people would look at this from a practical standpoint and say, well, what can I do to accept this renewal? And, you could argue on a sort of more general level with the book, you could read it as a renewal novel. It's not about an ending. Is there something happening there where humanity is being renewed, or being reminded that of their frailty, and that we need to think about a new way of living? This happens to us all the time. We just don't really like to acknowledge it very much.
No, I don't know that I necessarily hated Dirk. I just thought, yeah, he's a man who just looks at the practical side of things, and this kind of didn't affect him. So, he was going to move on and he was going to try and make lemonade out of lemons, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately with Dirk, he maybe goes a little bit too far in that he thinks about, I mean, I've heard people describe him as a pandemic profiteer,
Mm.
as someone who thinks, well, like I'm going to really play this to my advantage. And I suppose he does in the book, he's already talking about forming a militia and being a new leader in this town. So even people with the best of intentions can sometimes take it a bit too far.
Now, Chris, I'm not sure that I'm clever enough to pull off this next line of questioning, but numerology and
Ah,
astrology, as well as kind of this celestial undertone, give this book its sort of supernatural element. The book is divided into 9 parts, and the number 9 has obvious significance, not only as the age at which the children of the world are struck down by this mysterious attack, but there's also the reference to the cycle of 9. So I wondered if you could talk about the significance of this, because I'm guessing it's not all accidental.
well, you say you're not that clever to ask this question, but you're actually the first person to ask this question, and I'm surprised other people haven't picked up on this. The cycle of 9 is expressly mentioned by a few characters, and there is something going on with the number 9 throughout the book, which we can't really give too much away about that. And there is 9 parts. You're actually the first person to point that out to me, even though I thought it would be really obvious. Yes, so there is something a little bit about the numerology and the power of the number 9 that is related to what's going on. I did think about this stuff, and I did look up the number 9 when I realized the kids were 9 in the dream, and thought, what the hell is going on here? I mean, you can go down rabbit holes on the internet with this stuff and find out all sorts of things about the historical meaning of the number 9 and the sort of celestial meaning of the number 9. And there's hints about all that throughout. But again, that's the sort of thing that I don't really want to explain it too much, because I think I like to leave these things for the reader to explore on their own. And if the number 9 is something that strikes a chord with the reader and they want to explore, there's some quite interesting things for them to look up in that regard.
Yes, I'm glad to know that I'm not, as dumb as I thought I was.
You're much smarter than you think you are. That's what it is.
Okay. Now, I don't profess to know much about astrology, the stars, or the zodiac,
Mm.
or anything like that, but I was intrigued by the reference to twin stars. Now, let me get this right: Zebenil Janubi and Zeneshimali, twin stars around Jupiter, which I'd never heard of before. Tell me more about these stars and their significance to the night sky, and in particular, the character Sky's journey in this novel.
Yeah, so Sky is the 17-year-old daughter of Dirk. She's quite an interesting character in that she sort of becomes quite protective of Ebony, who's the 8-year-old, who's Haley's 8-year-old, who's on the chopping block. And Sky, she likes astronomy and is quite a student of the night sky. And she's kind of the only one in the book who is really thinking this through and trying to work out. She's the only one who's sort of wondering what's going on, whereas everyone else is reacting to what's happened. She's thinking a little bit more deeply about why it might have happened. And she has her theories on that, I suppose. Again, that's a little sort of teaser for the reader to think, is there something there? Is she onto something? And those twin stars, which are the northern and southern claw of the scorpion, they are real stars in the night sky. Zubanesh Amali is the only green star in the sky. And I kind of love the idea that maybe there is, one of the theories about Orpheus Nine is related to that star and what other worlds might lie in orbit around that star. And Sky talks about wishing that she had been born at a different time so that she could, 500 years into our future, so that she could actually explore the stars. And I've always sort of felt that a little bit too. I was always a fan of science fiction growing up, and I kind of hoped we'd be up to that stage by now, but we're clearly pretty far off that. So, yeah, that otherworldly element introduced by Sky, I think that just provides a little extra sliver of something for the reader to consider when they're thinking about the book as to what might actually be going on. So there's something there, and I didn't want to explore it too deeply, but yeah, there's answers there somewhere.
So I guess it begs the question, what kind of other research did you have to do to bring this story to the page?
It's funny because my previous sort of novel, Mammoth, was intensely researched over a long period of time to the point where I never thought I was going to write the bloody thing. But because this one sort of came on me so suddenly, it was a bit of a case of writing it now and researching as you go along, or sort of researching after the fact. I think there's a bit of perhaps a misunderstanding about books, that they are very intellectual exercises where you sit down and treat them like a sort of a university essay, and you think, okay, I'm going to plan it all out. I know what themes I'm going to deal with. This is the research I have to do. And often it's not really the case. The story just sort of hits you, and you're reacting to it and realizing, as you're going along, bloody hell, I'm going to have to now find out about the number nine or Latin. So a lot of the research is sort of done on the fly as you're going along. So this one wasn't actually heavily researched at all, apart from me trying to work out what the heck was going on. It's a funny thing, I wrote the book, it's got my name on it, but at a certain point, sometimes with books, it feels like they just become something other than you, and you're not really sure how they exist. I sort of feel like that, but with all my books, really. I sort of wonder, I feel a distance from them after a while, that they feel like artifacts separate from me. And harking back to what we said before, the guy who wrote this, he's gone. It was a few years ago he wrote this, so I'm not that guy anymore. But now I'm the new version of that guy having to explain this book. So it's kind of like talking about someone else's work. It's a really odd thing.
I was going to ask you about Mammoth because it seemed like a very research intensive kind of novel. And I did wonder if you thought this novel was easier to write.
Easier in the sense that it kind of wrote itself, and I was a bit of an observer in the process, and it wrote itself quite quickly. But that's sort of frustrating in its own way, because like we've talked about, anyone who's creative tries to exert some sort of control over their creativity and say, okay, I know how to write books. I know because there's a bunch of them on my shelf with my name on them. But do I know how to write them? Every time it feels like I don't know, and that I have to learn some new way of doing it. And it's one of the reasons why I've never really taught writing. I've been asked to teach it a few times, but I don't have an academic background. I wouldn't know where to begin. And also because I still don't really know how to do it. Every time is some sort of new process, and that's kind of frustrating. Mammoth turned out pretty good in the end. I'm very pleased with it, and that book will follow me around for the rest of my life. There'll always be someone asking me about that book, but that's kind of fun that it has a life of its own. But the funny thing about that is that people assume I'm a paleontologist because I wrote about fossils. And it actually got me a job at Melbourne Museum because they thought I was an expert in paleontology as well. So I worked there for a little while as a result of it. So strange where the creative mind takes you, but it's a sort of elusive, slippery thing. And I've never really been able to get a very firm grip on how my creative mind works. And I'm sort of learning the older I get to stop trying and just on whatever way it comes up with of writing a book, I'm just going to go with it and stay out of its way. Really, it feels like a separate entity living within me, and that is an odd thing to be living with. But I suppose we're all a bit like that. We've all got multiple personalities living inside our heads that rear up at different times. So it's more of an acknowledgement of the sort of essential schizophrenic nature of the creative mind, that I don't fully understand how to do it. And sometimes research is obviously required, and other times perhaps less so. I just have to accept that and stay out of the way.
Now I'm a little bit trepidatious about asking you the next question, but I
Go
normally
on.
ask I normally ask my guest authors for tips for aspiring authors and writers who might be listening to the podcast. And given all that you've just said, I mean, I don't know if you still want to give that a shot.
My sort of tips might be a little bit different to most in that, like for me, writing's not an intellectual exercise. I already said that. It's more of an emotional one, and it sort of comes from the heart and the gut. But I'm not a complete moron at the same time. I don't have much of a formal education, and I had to look, ironically, had to look up this word when someone called me it. I'm an autodidact, which I didn't know what that was, and it means you're self-taught. Sort of funny that I had to look it up. And also a polymath, apparently, which is someone who's interested in lots of different things. As a result of that, I feel a little bit differently, perhaps, than some writers do about writing. I certainly didn't study it at university or anything. I think, that old, adage that people say, write what you know, I think that gets a little bit misunderstood to mean write about you, which is fine to write about you, but it doesn't have to be that. You can write about something that you know. And it might not be something that has anything to do with you or how you've lived. You might be someone who loves reality cooking shows. You might be someone who knows a lot about them. You might be someone who knows a lot about, French history from 1783. Whatever it is that your thing is, your obsessions, your passions, I think if you're trying to be a writer and it's something that you really feel strongly about doing, you know, it's sort of easier almost if you can step outside of yourself. I think it's quite a bit of a trap that people very easily fall into is to just think, okay, I'm going to write a book. It'll be about me. There's an assumption that you're inherently interesting and you may not be, that whatever has happened to you is obviously very important to you, but it may not be something that resonates very much with readers. I kind of like this idea of looking at humanity from another perspective. And I think that's what I did with Mammoth and Here Be Leviathans, which was, you could argue those books are a little bit about me, but they're quite heavily disguised in that they are about the things that I'm interested in. I've never really talked about myself at all in my books, but if you read my books, you'd probably have a fairly good idea of who I am, which is, there's a dichotomy there. I've never written a memoir, I probably never would, but you can still know a little bit about me by reading my fiction. And I think therein lies the sort of creative challenge for aspiring authors is can you talk about yourself and the things that you're interested in without it being really obvious that you're doing so.
Fantastic. I love it. Thank you so much for sharing that, Chris. So you kind of gave us a little bit of a clue about what you might be working on next. Perhaps a sequel to Orpheus Nine?
Yeah, I mean, I do have that crazy wild sequel idea that will just get on people's nerves. So I am thinking about that, but I have this sort of process whereby I have quite an active imagination, and often ideas will come to me, and I'll just park them and have a think about them for a while and let them develop. One of the things I often tell people is that if you ask me what I'm working on, the answer is that I have multiple projects in various stages of development. In that I'll have like 10 things on the go. Some of them that might have been there for years, some of them might be only months, and they're all at various stages. But I've sort of learned to let them, saute in their own sauce and see if they're worthwhile. And then occasionally one will shove its way to the front of the queue and say, it's time for you to pay me some attention. And that will advance. So I have a couple of other things that are at quite an advanced stage now because I've been working on them off and on for years. So suddenly I find myself with, 3 or 4 other books that have had multiple drafts and that are suddenly all coming to fruition at once. And that's a bit of an unusual circumstance. Irritates my author friends. So we're going to sit down with my publisher at some point soon and say, okay, there's a few things here that are pretty advanced stage. Which one should we do next? Which one should we release next? Which one should we do the edits on next? Because there's a little bit of, strategy involved there. You have to, this is my 5th book and it's quite different to the other ones. And there's a challenge there, in that you risk dividing your readership or the readers that you've just got, you risk then alienating them by doing something totally different next time. But at the same time, I don't want to be one of those authors who just writes the same book again and again and again. That won't be challenging to me creatively. So I want to do something a little bit different each time. but there's a little bit of planning involved there. I do have a couple of wild books that I would not release next because it would be too much of a leap from this one. But we'll work towards them gently with a couple of other books that are coming up. So yeah, there's two that I have that are pretty advanced. So I'm going to have a chat to my publisher later this month and see how she feels about which one we'll do next. But they're all going to be in that same Black Mirror, Stephen King type vein, but set in Australia, recognizable Australia, where there's just something very strange going on. So won't be that different from Orpheus Nine, although there'll be no more exploding 9-year-olds, I promise.
Good to hear. And I guess it's a watch this space.
Yes, and now that I'm with Hachette, they're going to come out a little bit more often. So you'll probably be sick of the sight of me over the next few years as I have books with like alarming premises and covers coming out.
Ah, no, fantastic. Look forward to hearing more about them in the fullness of time, Chris. So I guess I just wanted to offer you a final opportunity to say what you'd like readers to take away from this novel.
I think empathy is the thing that I wanted to talk about most in the book, in that when you start out encountering Jess and Dirk and Haley, you will establish a certain feeling towards them. You know, you might be sympathetic, you might not be. And then as the novel goes on, particularly the middle section where it jumps back to when they were 18 and you find out more about what made them the people that they are, I think there'll be, or at least I hope that in a lot of cases for readers, that their loyalties towards the characters might change at that point, and you might suddenly think, oh, I hated Dirk, but now I sort of know where he's coming from. I sort of feel bad for him. And I wanted to do that on purpose so that by the time you reach the ending of the book, you're not quite sure who are the good guys, who are the bad guys, because we're all good guys, we're all bad guys, we're all of those things. And it's more important to think about empathy for someone who is going through a challenge in life rather than judging them. And I think that's one of the overriding, hopes I have for the book, is that if it enables people to think a little bit more in empathetic terms rather than judgmental terms, then I've succeeded, hopefully.
Indeed, you have. Chris, I have thoroughly enjoyed chatting with you about this incredible story. Thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
No worries. Thank you, Claudine. My pleasure. I'll see you again next time.
That's it for this episode, folks. Hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. If so, I'd love it if you'd leave a review on your preferred listening platform, which may include Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon Music. Until next time, friends, happy reading.